how did globalization, once hailed as a pathway for growth and prosperity, give way to tariff wars now dominating international trade?
I do have a few other questions regarding the same. There was certainly another interesting thing that you highlighted, which talked about existing capital and Make in India mission. So I have a question regarding that how India has historically seen its trade policy as a tool for development and asserting its self-reliance, be it during 1991 economic reforms or recent policies, as you mentioned, centered around Make in India. So in this particular context, how can India policymaker balance the nationalistic narrative with the realities of global economic independence?
Sure. Well, I think if you look at what globalization, the kind of bargain globalization offered the world, the idea was that if you eliminate barriers to trade, if you make trade really predictable, if you give businesses a lot of confidence that governments won't get in the way of goods moving across borders, then those businesses will invest abroad. They'll find the most efficient places to build elements of supply chains, to build factories, to extract resources, to create jobs. And that will drive down the cost of goods and services for consumers and maximize efficiency. And what we've seen recently is governments starting to rethink that bargain, whether that's for environmental reasons in the European Union, or more recently in the United States for Donald Trump, for a mix of national security, diplomatic, and what's traditionally called protectionist kind of economic reasons. He's begun to rethink that bargain and started to act contrary to that bargain by prioritizing other things over that predictability for business and investment. And here we are. I'm raising tariffs, and the only ones I'm going to hurt, and you see President Trump say this all the time, he would say, listen, this is going to be money that foreigners are going to pay us, while at the same time we create jobs in America. So it creates the illusion that he's not making a choice between different interests inside America. That if there are winners and losers, all of the losers are abroad. And that's never really the case in any kind of policy, but certainly not in trade policy. I think we can identify 4 things that they're trying to do. They would like to raise some money for the US Treasury so that they have more money to play with to do what they want to do in terms of domestic spending. So they'd like to raise some capital. They would like to encourage manufacturing to move back to the United States or to start up in the United States by locking out foreign competition. They would like to create bargaining chips they can use in negotiations with countries like India to address the things about the Indian trade regime that annoy them. So they would like to effectively create some negotiating leverage from nothing so that they can then trade it off for things about your regime that they want to change. And they believe that a dependence on China for intermediate goods, critical raw materials, certain forms of technology is an economic weakness for the United States. And so they would like to push for a decoupling and push supply chains out of China. When your leader, when Modi is speaking about Make in India, he has to simultaneously have a conversation with the Indian public where he says, this is why this is a good idea, this is why you want to do this, and this is how I'll protect you. But at the same time, he is effectively speaking to global finance and global supply chain operators to basically say, here's why my government won't be a problem for you, and in fact will be your supporter in coming in and investing in India, building in India, manufacturing in India. Crossing internal borders in India can be more difficult than crossing some international borders if we are talking about goods. One of the reasons the US is an economic powerhouse is that it can leverage its diversity really efficiently. You can take resources from the Rocky Mountains, combine them with capital from New York, with design from San Francisco and Washington State, and then combine it into something that is manufactured in Detroit.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Geointerview. This one indeed is a special one for all of us. as we host today Mr. Dmitry Grozoubinski, who is a former Australian trade negotiator and diplomat, now based in Geneva, where he serves as the executive director of Geneva Trade Platform and founder of consultancy Acclaimed Trade. Not only that, he's also the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What You Need to Know About It. In the light of same, today's interview will be focusing upon trade landscape and how it has evolved and what implication it has for regional and global trade dynamics. Mr. Dmitry, thank you so much for sparing your time. We are delighted to have you here today. How are you feeling?
I'm very well, and it's a pleasure to join GeoStrata again. I always have fun when I hang out with you folks.
That was really happy to hear about that. Looking forward to have an insightful session with you today. So without further ado, let's move on to the question. Perhaps Digvijay, I believe you would like to begin with few of yours.
Yeah, thank you, Agrima, for giving me the opportunity. Hello and good evening, Mr. Grozoubinski. I hope you're doing well. And now, before we move forward with the questions that we prepared for you, I want to get your perspective on the changing dynamics of global trade with a particular focus on tariffs, right? Now, how did globalization, once hailed as a pathway for growth and prosperity, give way to tariff wars now dominating international trade?
Sure. Well, I think if you look at what globalization, the kind of bargain globalization offered the world, the idea was that if you eliminate barriers to trade, if you make trade really predictable, if you give businesses a lot of confidence that governments won't get in the way of goods moving across borders, then those businesses will invest abroad. They'll find the most efficient places to build elements of supply chains, to build factories, to extract resources, to create jobs. And that will drive down the cost of goods and services for consumers and maximize efficiency. And that was the bargain. But the trade-off for that bargain is that governments would have less flexibility to use their borders or the borders of their countries and the policies there to pursue different objectives. They would have less ability to pick a sector and lock out competition to that sector. They'd have less ability to discern and say imports from one country are good, but we don't want imports from another country, and so on. And what we've seen recently is governments starting to rethink that bargain, whether that's for environmental reasons in the European Union, or more recently in the United States for Donald Trump, for a mix of national security, diplomatic, and what's traditionally called protectionist kind of economic reasons. He's begun to rethink that bargain and started to act contrary to that bargain by prioritizing other things over that predictability for business and investment. And here we are.
Yeah, surely. I agree to all of that you said, but I also think that this is one of the that breaking point in all of global trade history, which we have to like move forward with, right? Now, coming back to your book, Dimitri, you've argued that the reason why politicians misrepresent trade policies is that the subject is complex, right? And the public cannot easily challenge such misrepresentation or even comment on its nature. Can you throw some light on the notion with maybe some examples or some learnings that we've had from the past?
Absolutely. So almost anything we do in trade policy, we're telling a story about the future. We're saying, for example, if we sign this free trade agreement between India and Australia, it will create jobs. Or maybe if you don't like the free trade agreement, you say it'll destroy jobs because a cheap flood of something will come in. So you're almost always telling a story about the future, knowing that the test of whether you're telling the truth or not may not come for many, many years. And when it does, you'll always be able to point to other factors. You'll be able to say, well, it would have created thousands of jobs, but the war in Ukraine drove up the cost of energy, for example. And so I wasn't lying when I said it. It's just that things changed in the universe, and I proved to be incorrect in hindsight. So because it is forward-looking and because it is very complex and often counterintuitive, it is easy to tell a story about the fact that the decision that I am making, whatever my trade policy, whether it's to be more open or more closed, has no downsides. At least no downsides domestically. I'm raising tariffs and the only ones I'm going to hurt, and you see President Trump say this all the time, he would say, listen, this is going to be money that foreigners are going to pay us, while at the same time we create jobs in America. So it creates the illusion that he's not making a choice between different interests inside America. That if there are winners and losers, all of the losers are abroad. And that's never really the case in any kind of policy, but certainly not in trade policy.
Yeah, surely I think there are numerous perspectives that can be put forward regarding trade policies of a nation, right? There are numerous exceptions to attach to that as well.
Of course, every country's trade policy is incredibly complex and very much shaped by really domestic historical factors, which is why every country's trade policy has individual things that if you decided to pick up on something, to get upset about it, you could definitely find it. And this is something we're seeing a lot now with the Trump administration, where when they're trying to tell a story about the injustices that they are trying to right, they will look through a country's entire trade regime and pick out the one or two things that are particularly easy to explain as a problem. So say, look how high Indian agricultural tariffs are. And they will focus on that as if that's the entire trade regime of India, when of course it has, you can look at it as having 18,000 different tariff lines. It's a complex beast, but as you say, every country has individual things that it does for all sorts of reasons that you can bring to the surface and get really upset about if you decide to.
Yeah, that threw an important light on the topic as well. I think my colleague Agrima would have some questions regarding tariffs since we are discussing global trade.
Surely. Thank you, Digvijay, to pass the mic. So as we began our discussion around tariff itself, it perhaps brings me to another important question that will get us to the right heart of global trade tension. You have talked about how United States has been increasingly using tariff as a strategic tool, particularly in its trade relation with China. So from your perspective, what is the underlying motivation behind America's tariff measures? Are they primarily economic, political, or security driven? And how do you see China responding to this shift in trade dynamics?
It's a really big question, Agro. I'll do my best, and to try to keep this interview from being 6 hours, I will attempt to answer this as briefly as I can. So I think with the Trump administration, there's very rarely only one motivation. It's often a mix of things where they are trying to accomplish a number of objectives and seeing which one they can get traction on. So specifically, I think we can identify 4 things that they're trying to do. They would like to raise some money for the US Treasury so that they have more money to play with to do what they want to do in terms of domestic spending. So they'd like to raise some capital. They would like to encourage manufacturing to move back to the United States or to start up in the United States by locking out foreign competition. They would like to create bargaining chips they can use in negotiations with countries like India to address the things about the Indian trade regime that annoy them. So they would like to effectively create some negotiating leverage from nothing so that they can then trade it off for things about your regime that they want to change. And they believe that a dependence on China for intermediate goods, critical raw materials, certain forms of technology is an economic weakness for the United States. And so they would like to push for a decoupling and push supply chains out of China. Now, all 4 of those things are in parts contradictory. It's difficult to work out at any given day which one the Trump administration is really focused on at the expense of the others. And I think that tends to change almost hour by hour as different factions within the Trump orbit kind of gain and lose ascendancy. But those are, I think, the broad set of objectives. It's also fair to say that Donald Trump himself is a fan of tariffs as a tool. So the means rather than the ends is attractive here. He just likes tariffs. He likes the fact that a series of acts and bills and quirks in the US political system mean that he can apply and take away tariffs at the stroke of a pen in a way that he couldn't with most other policies, which would require legislation going through Congress, getting around the filibuster and so forth. Here, the president giveth and the president taketh away. It's a very versatile and very powerful tool. He just gets to swing around. So I think that's an element of it as well. More than what he's trying to achieve, he likes using this to try to achieve it. And then finally, as to the second half of your question about how China will respond, I think we are seeing it. The tariffs certainly have a negative impact on the Chinese economy, but in a lot of ways, the way this has been done is a gift to China. China finds itself for the first time having a sense of the moral high ground on all of these issues. They are presenting themselves as followers of the multilateral trading system, as calm, rational players on the world stage that are subject to this unprovoked, incredibly escalatory attack. So they're able to tell a really positive story about themselves diplomatically and geopolitically. The attack came at a moment when I think China was feeling optimistic about its future, and the same moment when Americans perhaps weren't so much, following the launch of things like DeepSeek, following the runaway success of Chinese electric vehicles and so on. There's a sense of optimism in China that is a good asset to have as a leader if you are going into a protracted struggle. So they're feeling optimistic about that. And also the way the US went about this without what feels like a great deal of planning and forethought, or really even strategic targeting, means that China's found itself with quite a few levers to pull in order to punch back. And we're beginning to see this in whether it's the absolute collapse of soybean and oil purchases from the US, the export restrictions and export bans on critical raw materials, the sort of export control regime, and so on. There's an extent to which China has been planning for this moment for over a decade, and the US kind of woke up one morning and did it. And so the Chinese have found that whatever you may think about the balance of economic power between the US and China, the US threw the first punch without properly setting its feet and getting into a stance. And so to the extent that China probably didn't want this battle, but finds itself in a very good position to fight it, at least in the short to medium term. And I think they're looking to take advantage of that. And I don't think they're particularly inclined to make the first move towards backing down, as it seems like the Trump administration badly wants them to do.
Really insightful conversation that we just had over that question, where you provided us strategically laying it down for us and our audience to understand what exactly we talk about when we have this light over India and over China and US particularly. Now I want to circle back to your book and want to talk about how the opposing view reflect upon the real world opposing experiences, and if in a way that these also be real for why these lies endure in your book, and what exactly is your perspective upon these lies that goes about that politician tells in terms of trade to the audience?
I think if I've understood your question, you're kind of asking, well, what is the opposition to the lies? How does that play out in the political discourse? And I have to say, I think the trade policy community has a lot to answer for here, in terms of, I don't think we as a collective have been very effective in laying out the opposite case, the opposing case, as you call it. In part, I think because for us in the West, and this certainly hasn't been true in India, but for us in the West, there was a consensus around the underlying value of globalization and the rules-based system for so long that a lot of us lost the muscle memory of how we tell a positive story about all this, while those inclined to lie about it or distort it got very good at it. So a lot of us have been really bad at communicating why this has value, any kind of value to a normal person. Bad at communicating to normal people why so much of this is hard and complicated. Just how much is, most people have no idea how much is involved in terms of bureaucracy, work, information, communication, just to get a box from Delhi to Washington, D.C. This is an entire professional art and craft that most people have no idea about because it happens behind the scenes. And we haven't been good at telling that story and telling the story of what happens when governments start throwing wrenches into the works. But then finally, let me say that I think we've also not necessarily been very good at admitting the limits of our ideology. If a factory in a small town in India, where it is the bedrock of the economy, closes because it has been outcompeted by a foreign competitor, economics would say, well, listen, that's a more efficient distribution of resources. Those workers can now specialize in something else. There'll be a more effective yada, yada, yada. The economics say that that is a good outcome. But in practice, that's not really how it works. A 54-year-old Indian factory worker is not suddenly going to become a financial analyst in Mumbai, even if that is what the sort of economics says is the trade-off here. So we've been really bad at saying, listen, we don't have a very good answer for what happens when linchpin factories, when agricultural produce becomes non-competitive, and what to do in the short, medium, and even long term with the people that globalization sometimes snookers out of what used to be lucrative careers. And that's not to say that you could protect those jobs forever. Automation, climate change, and other things are imperiling employment, perhaps even more than trade is. But at the end of the day, if we're saying that, if we're going to talk about trade having no losers, we are just going to make people upset, because it really does sometimes.
That was a really interesting framing that you gave us in order to understand what exactly your book talks about and how we see and perceive these lies. So one thing that you also mentioned was how trade often get simplified and is surrounded by these simplistic narratives of winners and losers. However, the complexities that you just talked about are highlighted previously through our answers about global chain value system, along with the fact that trade dynamics almost never transform into zero-sum games. How can policymakers and public then better understand the real impact of these trade agreements?
So my advice is really simple. Just keep asking what's actually changed. So often when you see the way that politicians talk about trade agreements or trade policy, they speak in these like broad value terms of, we're going to make trade easier, or we are going to protect local businesses, or we are going to change regulations to make them more efficient. And almost always you can kind of get to the bottom and separate rhetoric from reality by saying, okay, well, just explain to me, if I am currently moving a box across a border between these two countries, and you've said that this agreement is going to make my life massively easier, walk me through how. I was moving a box before, I was paying a certain amount of tax, I was filling in certain forms. You've told me that my life is about to get massively better. Well, am I going to pay less tax? Am I going to fill in fewer forms? What are you actually changing in terms of, in practice, the way that goods and services, capital and ideas flow across borders? And if chances are, if the person who's trying to sell you on their idea or frighten you about someone else's idea can't answer a question like that, can't give a single practical example about how you as a small business owner who wants to trade across borders will actually be affected by this, there's a very good chance that everything else they're saying is dubious too.
That was really nicely put by you, how we need to, as an audience and as like common public, need to answer the how and why of the boxes moving across the border and even the ideas that move across. I hope that really help our audience and us to understand on how these trade dynamics really function. With that, I would like to give the mic back to Dikvijay in order for him to ask you the further questions.
Thank you, Agrima. Now, Mr. Grozoubinski, coming back to your book again. Now, your research talks at length on the political incentives that catalyze trade misrepresentation, right? Now, how are these incentives different for different nations vis-a-vis, let's say, developing and the developed economies? And what are some lessons that can be drawn from their experience?
That's a really good question. It's generous of you to describe what went into my book as research rather than just vibes and me saying stuff. That's very kind of you. Look, you're asking me to paint with a very broad brush. Obviously, incentives vary massively across different political structures, but I do think it does come back to whether you are in a wealthy developed nation or a developing country that is growing, you expect your government to be making decisions in order to make your life better. And you are worried that they will make decisions that will make your life worse. So in both cases, politicians have an incentive to reach for trade policy and saying, this is my toolbox and I am going to use it to make you wealthier. And my opponent wants to use it in ways that will make you poorer or expose you to threats or be dangerous in some other way. I think perhaps part of the difference is that where developed countries tend to be rich already, and the question is, how do we maintain that wealth and that standard of living and maintain the flow of opportunities? For developing countries, sometimes the question is, okay, well, what do we do to move up the development ladder? If we are currently at an agricultural level of development, how do we transition from that into, say, manufacturing or services? How do we attract capital and so on and so forth? And so that leads to slightly different conversations. With that said, I think even countries that are at a lower level of development can be very scared about what they will lose. They feel like they have a lot to lose from trade policy. So they can often they can be just as defensive as a developed country that has seemingly on paper a lot more to lose in terms of wealth. So that can bring it back to the same kind of ideas. The one thing I would say is that in terms of the difference, one thing that very wealthy developed countries often have that developing countries don't is existing capital. So developed countries, especially nowadays, do not have to have the same kind of two parallel conversations that developing countries have to have. So when your leader, when Modi is speaking about Make in India, he has to simultaneously have a conversation with the Indian public where he says, this is why this is a good idea, this is why you want to do this, and this is how I'll protect you. But at the same time, he is effectively speaking to global finance and global supply chain operators to basically say, here's why my government won't be a problem for you, and in fact will be your supporter in coming in and investing in India, building in India, manufacturing in India. And so that kind of duality where he's having to have two conversations at once that have inherent tension is something that I think for example, Donald Trump doesn't worry about as much because there is so much capital in the US already. All he really has to do is stop it going elsewhere. And I think that is something that can color the difference as well.
Right. Now, that's an interesting perspective to highlight the divide between the two sides, right? The developed and the developing economies, because obviously it comes down to the original things, that is the capital and labor, right? Now, given the general perception that the existence of regional trade agreements tends to reduce both tariffs and political incentives for misrepresentation, right? To an extent, because of the localized nature of the agreement. But how do you think that international cooperation and institutional design can be leveraged to promote greater transparency and accuracy in trade data and its reporting?
That's a really good question. I think something that I think the general public doesn't realize is how data and information starved the trade officials representing it are. I think there is a perception that when a trade negotiator goes into an agreement, they are sitting there with incredibly detailed, well-organized, well-sourced data at their fingertips that they can draw on to work out at almost a product or firm level. Okay, if we raise tariffs by 3%, how much of what we currently sell becomes non-competitive or becomes competitive, and that they are able to micro-target that way from a kind of tower of information that they're standing on top of. But in practice, that's not what it's like for 99% of negotiators. We have comparatively limited data, we have limited resources. I have trained the Indian Administrative Service, I've met with many of the Indian negotiators, and they will tell you firsthand that they are short-handed, they are overworked, and they are run ragged. They do not have time to go off into a quiet room and spend 3 weeks digging into some curious aspect of the sorghum wheat supply chain to work out exactly what decimal point to change tariffs to. So given that, what can sometimes therefore drive policy is not data, but a combination of historical interests, lobbying, sort of squeaky wheels getting the kicks, the things that get media attention will be vastly over-leveraged, and then just negotiators doing their best, negotiators and policymakers doing their best to guess, to kind of infer what they think is important, what a change will do. So anything we can do to improve the incentives for governments and firms to provide transparency into more or less universally trusted, or at least universally well-regarded systems, whether that is something like the ITC's trade map, whether it's UN Comtrade, the World Bank databases, anything we can do to improve the incentives for people to put data in there significantly decreases the likelihood that a nation's trade policy or trade objectives will be dominated by moneyed special interests, people who happen to have the ear of the government, or just, you know, the same things they've been pushing for 100 years because that's what they push for. So with that regard, there's a lot that can be done in terms of improving reporting standards, making things easy, in providing development money to do things like build APIs that allow computers to talk to other computers and automatically send data without it becoming a burden on policymakers, especially in developing countries. Any of these kind of things we can do. I also think, last comment, governments should become significantly more relaxed about things like standardizing reporting into something like the US dollar. It's not because I love the US dollar, it's just there's a whole bunch of IO reporting that's not done into the US dollar because governments will object, saying, why would we pick the US currency? well, it's the global reserve currency, it's a global trade currency. It's just a lot easier to deal with if I don't have a spreadsheet that has 147 currencies on it. So these kind of things, which for political reasons governments get upset about, we could probably stand to be about 10% more relaxed without giving in to global US hegemony.
Now, this reply highlights actually the sheer amount of volume at which trade takes place, right? And all the elements that are involved in it. It doesn't take place in a vacuum, right? There are numerous stakeholders, there are numerous aspects which the governments have to consider, right? And bringing a standardization into like reporting and accuracy in trade data is not that easy of a task, right? So I think that is important, that governments should be relaxed and they should leave things out of their domain for some part in trade and let the market forces do their work, right? Now, I think Agrima would have some questions regarding this as well. Agrima?
Thank you, Digvijay. Yes, I do have a few other questions regarding the same. There was certainly another interesting thing that you highlighted, which talked about existing capital and Make in India mission. So I have a question regarding that how India has historically seen its trade policy as a tool for development and asserting its self-reliance, be it during 1991 economic reforms or recent policies, as you mentioned, centered around Make in India. So in this particular context, how can India policymaker balance the nationalistic narrative with the realities of global economic independence?
Yeah, I mean, this is an absolutely huge question. I think it's fair to say, as you kind of did there, that India has historically taken a much more cautious view towards plugging into global trade and investment flows than many other countries. The obvious comparison is to China over the last 30 years that took a very FDI focused approach to its development, as compared to India, which was a lot more cautious about the implications of outside investment and how to balance that with sort of the pursuit of Indian objectives at the federal and sort of state level. The challenge, I think, for Indian policymakers remains: how do you balance the story you want to tell investors with what you want to do domestically? I know that there has been some frustration among the Indian government that while there has been some tech investment and India's making more tech than it ever has before, the pace isn't nearly as quick or the scale nearly as large as Indian policymakers would love to see. And in part, that is very candidly because India is a difficult regulatory environment. Crossing internal borders in India can be more difficult than crossing some international borders if we are talking about goods. There are reasons for this. This isn't me attacking India. This is the way that the Indian system has developed. And at every juncture, the government is faced with choices about those existing policies and what they achieve versus being able to, for example, build an efficient across India supply chain where you can do what the US does, for example. One of the reasons the US is an economic powerhouse is that it can leverage its diversity really efficiently. You can take resources from the Rocky Mountains, combine them with capital from New York, with design from San Francisco and Washington State, and then combine it into something that is manufactured in Detroit. India has that same kind of diversity among different parts of India, right? Like southern India has very different economic strengths to, say, northwestern India. But moving things around India is more difficult for a whole host of reasons. And so this is something the government is kind of grappling with because, of course, Indian regions have strong democracy and strong sense of autonomy. And the differences that exist between them are there for a reason. So this is the challenge for India moving forward. One, I would say two final things. In where India has had incredible success has been in the export of services by effectively doing an end run around a lot of what is traditionally thought of as trade policy. The selling of business process operations across or IT services across borders. That kind of stuff wasn't touched at all by trade policy until 1996, and even now is very light touch. So it's been able to have success in that. And then secondly, I think the future of Indian manufacturing, like the future of everybody's manufacturing, is simply not as labor intensive as manufacturing has been in the past. If you are looking at a country of well over 1 billion people, as incomes rise, there is no future in which a significant percentage of the Indian population works in manufacturing, because manufacturing does not work that way anymore. The factory, even the iPhone factories in India will simply not employ hundreds of thousands of people in the future. They'll be automated. They will employ very highly qualified Indian engineers and robotics specialists and IT specialists. So one thing that India does have to think about is, how does manufacturing play into a future vision of India, where the majority of people will almost certainly be working in services, because that's what a prosperous country does. It'll be a consumption and services-based economy, same as everyone else. So how does manufacturing fit into that? And how do you make sure you're not undermining that objective through your trade and industrial policy?
Thank you for that. That crucially highlights both problems and solutions that India can look up to and our trade policies can transform into. Interestingly, another thing that you mentioned was about manufacturing sector and automation to talk about. So the general perception that goes around with the trade liberalization is it leads to job losses, especially when you're talking about manufacturing, as we just touched upon through the last reply that you gave to us. So in that case and scenario, how are we looking forward to this complex dynamics between automation, employment, and trade in a mature economies? And also, are we oversimplifying the story by blaming the trade when automation might be a bigger disruptor in the room?
Yeah, really good question. I think we absolutely are. As I think Digvijay said earlier, there are always 1,000 factors. It's really easy to oversimplify this stuff. One reason, let's begin by saying that it's not just that globalization is blamed for job losses in manufacturing. Specifically, lower wages abroad are blamed for job losses in manufacturing. And that has not been true, perhaps ever, but certainly not right now. If what determined where factories went was exclusively the cost of labor, or even predominantly the cost of labor, every factory in the world would be in North Korea or maybe South Sudan. Certainly, Bangladesh would be vastly outcompeting, say, India, and definitely China, where wages are rising quite quickly. What determines manufacturing success is often things like logistics, scale, ease of doing business, reliability of services like electricity, how educated your population is. Why is India such a dominant player in the international IT and accounting export markets? Because a couple of decades ago, there was a set of government policy decisions that meant that Indian universities created a hell of a lot of IT specialists and a hell of a lot of accountants, and there are a lot of educated people in India who were ready and entrepreneurial enough to create these opportunities. So a whole bunch of things go into why a factory in Ohio closes because it is outcompeted by a factory in Shenzhen. So I think that's important to begin with, that not that simple oversimplification where it's like, oh, a greedy company just found someone willing to work for a fraction of the price and everything, and that's why what's going on. It's a lot more complicated than that. But secondly, I think your question, Agrama, really gets to something we don't have an answer for, which is that especially in the West, especially in countries that were perhaps less directly affected by World War II, in that the fighting did not majorly happen on their territories, like the United States, perhaps Australia, the United Kingdom, there was for a brief moment a job trajectory where someone could graduate high school and get a very respectably paying job for life at a union factory and support an entire family on that factory income in a middle-class lifestyle that, frankly, most people in India would still kill for. This was a weird confluence of historical and economic factors that is a driving force in the current politics in a lot of the West, but is never coming back. We will never be, I think, at a point where manufacturing employment can provide a high-paying job for life for a high school graduate and on a large national scale, for all of the reasons you've both mentioned and that we've been talking about so far. So what that means is we have a significant population of people who remember that time, who feel a loss of power, agency, wealth, and dignity because it is increasingly unavailable. And we have not really found a good story to tell them that's optimistic about the future, because we do not know how to bring that kind of employment back. And the kind of employment we are creating is going to university graduates and people with specialized skills, or much younger people who are, for example, very digitally savvy, or who grew up in the monetizable ecosystem of, content creation and so on. And so this is something we genuinely do not have an answer for. And to the extent that we have anything positive to say at all, which is sort of, we can use government policies to support these people and, give them some kind of living, make sure that they are taken care of, that still doesn't answer the fundamental question of dignity, where previously you could be overwhelmed, generally speaking, the man of the house, the provider with your factory job who looked after his family. Even if you were to pay from government coffers that same amount, you're still robbing that person of the dignity they felt before as a person who was defined by their career, their job, their status as a provider, someone who was working for a living. And we very legitimately do not have a very good answer for that. In the Indian context, this is something I think India will have to grapple with if, as Indian agriculture becomes more automated. For example, there will be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially whose sense of identity and self and historical connection was defined by the work they did as farmers, that more efficient forms of automation will render less and less viable, who will not have a lot of skills that are transferable to business process operations for Ernst & Young in a big city. And so how you square that circle, it's a huge challenge, well beyond me to solve, but I think it's something that should be at the absolute forefront of our minds and hopefully policymakers' minds.
That really sum up the last reply that you gave to us, the policy and the approach that we would be looking forward even after this interview, and talking and critically analyzing about how agency and the whole image brings up and works as important dynamics when we talk about trade, or when we talk about the policies and a policymaker, or as even public that perceive those policies out there, and how we can critically analyze it. So that last reply really sums all of that interview questions that we just asked you.
Now, with that, we've come to an end of this interesting conversation, right? And thank you so much for joining, Mr. Grozoubinski. Your expertise has helped us unpack some of the very complex topics from the world of trade and globalization. And not to forget, folks, you have to read Mr. Grozoubinski's book. It's a must read. And it's been a pleasure hosting you today, sir, and hoping to have you here again.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry I left it on such a depressing note.